The radar screen showed two blips moving fast toward the destroyer. In the chaos of combat, seconds felt like hours. The gun deck was no place for a woman, they said. Naval tradition demanded it. But when Lieutenant Sarah Martinez dropped those two enemy jets in 6 seconds flat, the entire crew stood in stunned silence. What they didn't know was that this moment would shatter more than just enemy aircraft. It would break a century of naval tradition, challenge everything the brass believed about women in combat, and turn a young officer into a legend whispered about in naval academies worldwide. This is the story of the day a woman wasn't just allowed on the gun deck. She owned it. Lieutenant Sarah Martinez never planned to make history. Growing up in a small Texas town where Friday night football was religion and tradition ran deeper than oil wells, she was the daughter of a mechanic who fixed cars and a mother who taught second grade. Her childhood was filled with grease stains on her clothes and the sound of engines being tuned to perfection in her father's garage. From a moment she could hold a wrench, Sarah was fascinated by how things worked. While other kids played with dolls, she dismantled old radios and rebuilt them. Her fingers seemed to understand metal and circuits in a way that amazed even her father. Miguel Martinez would watch his daughter work and shake his head in wonder, telling anyone who would listen that his little girl had magic in her hands. The military wasn't even on Sarah's radar until her senior year of high school, when a Navy recruiter visited her advanced physics class. Commander James Sullivan, a decorated officer with 20 years of service, was there to talk about opportunities in naval engineering. Most of the students barely looked up from their phones, but Sarah hung on every word. After class, she approached him with questions that surprised him. She didn't ask about college money or travel opportunities like most students. Instead, she wanted to know about the newest weapons systems, radar technology, and how naval combat had evolved. Commander Sullivan found himself in a 40-minute conversation with a teenager who understood concepts that some of his junior officers struggled with. The Navy offered Sarah a full scholarship to study electrical engineering at the Naval Academy. Her parents were proud, but worried. Miguel had served briefly in the Army, and new military life wasn't easy, especially for women. But Sarah had already made up her mind. She wanted to serve, and she wanted to work with the most advanced technology the military had to offer. Her time at the Naval Academy was a constant battle. Not just the academic challenges, though those were intense, but the social ones. She was one of only 37 women in her class of over 1,000. The male cadets ranged from completely supportive to openly hostile. Some refused to acknowledge her presence, while others went out of their way to make her life difficult. Sarah's roommate, Jessica Chun, became her closest friend and strongest ally. Jessica, who came from a long line of Navy officers, understood the pressure in ways others couldn't. Together, they studied until their eyes burned, practiced drills until their muscles ached, and supported each other through the loneliest moments when it felt like the entire world was against them. The real test came during their third year, when they were assigned to weapons training. Sarah had always been good with her hands, but working with naval gun systems was different. These weren't car engines or radio circuits. These were complex weapons that could destroy aircraft traveling at hundreds of miles per hour. The margin for error was zero. Chief Petty Officer Robert Hayes ran the weapons program like a drill sergeant from an old war movie. He had been operating naval guns for 15 years and had strong opinions about who belonged on a gun deck. Women, in his view, didn't have the physical strength or mental toughness for combat weapons. He made this clear on the first day of training. Sarah bit her tongue and focused on the work. She learned every component of the Mark 38 gun system, memorized firing sequences until she could recite them in her sleep, and practiced target acquisition until her movements became automatic. While other cadets struggled with the complex timing required for effective anti-aircraft fire, Sarah seemed to have an intuitive understanding of how to lead a target and when to fire. During live-fire exercises, her accuracy was consistently in the top 5% of her class. She could track multiple targets simultaneously and make split-second decisions about which threats to engage first. Her instructors were impressed, but Chief Hayes remained skeptical. Excellence in training was one thing, he said. Combat was something entirely different. The sexual harassment started small. Comments about women not belonging in combat roles, suggestions that she was only there because of quotas, implications that she would break under pressure when lives were on the line. Sarah documented everything, but rarely reported it. She knew that complaining would only make things worse and give ammunition to those who said women couldn't handle military life. One night, someone left pornographic magazines in her locker with a note saying this was where women belonged. Another time, her gear was sabotaged before an important exercise, causing her to fail a timed drill. The message was clear. They wanted her to quit. But Sarah had learned toughness from her father, who had built a successful business from nothing, and determination from her mother, who had raised 4 children while working full-time. She wasn't going anywhere. Her breakthrough moment came during a complex simulation exercise in her final year. The scenario involved a destroyer under attack by multiple enemy aircraft while protecting a convoy of supply ships. Sarah was assigned to one of the gun positions, despite Chief Hayes' objections. The exercise began at dawn with clear skies and calm seas. But combat simulations never stayed simple. Within minutes, the radar operator reported incoming aircraft from multiple directions. The ship's defensive systems came alive as the crew prepared for battle. Sarah's position was responsible for protecting the starboard side of the ship. Her partner, Cadet Michael Torres, was an experienced shooter who had grown up hunting with his grandfather. Together, they were supposed to work as a team, with Torres calling targets and Sarah operating the gun system. But when the first wave of simulated aircraft appeared on their screens, moving faster than anything they had practiced against, Torres froze. The responsibility of potentially shooting down aircraft, even in simulation, overwhelmed him. He started to call out targets, but then stopped, unable to make decisions quickly enough. Sarah didn't hesitate. She took over target calling while simultaneously operating the gun system. Her hands moved across the controls with practiced precision, tracking multiple aircraft and calculating firing solutions faster than the computer could display them. In 60 seconds, she engaged and destroyed 4 simulated enemy aircraft without missing a shot. The exercise continued for another 20 minutes, with Sarah essentially running her station solo while Torres recovered his composure. When it ended, the entire bridge crew was silent. The simulation computer showed that her station had achieved the highest accuracy rating ever recorded for that exercise. Chief Hayes approached her afterward with an expression she had never seen from him before: respect. He didn't apologize for his previous behavior, but he shook her hand and said she had proven herself. Coming from him, that meant everything. Word of her performance spread quickly through the academy. Other cadets began seeking her advice on weapon systems, and instructors started using her techniques as examples in their classes. But Sarah knew that simulation success was just the beginning. Real combat would test her in ways no training exercise could replicate. After graduation, she was assigned to the USS Porter, a guided missile destroyer known for its advanced weapons systems and experienced crew. The ship's captain, Commander Patricia Walsh, was only the 3rd woman to command a destroyer in Navy history. She had specifically requested Sarah for her crew after reviewing her academy records. Captain Walsh had fought her own battles to reach command and understood the challenges facing women in naval combat roles. During Sarah's first meeting with the captain, Walsh was direct about her expectations. Sarah would be given every opportunity to prove herself, but she would also be held to the highest standards. There would be no special treatment and no excuses. The Porter was scheduled for deployment to the Mediterranean as part of a multinational naval exercise. Intelligence reports suggested that terrorist groups in the region had acquired advanced aircraft and might attempt to disrupt the exercise. It wasn't supposed to be a combat deployment, but everyone knew that situations could change quickly in that part of the world. Sarah's assignment was as an assistant gunnery officer, working under Lieutenant Commander David Kim, a veteran of 3 combat deployments. Kim had heard about her academy performance and was curious to see how she would handle real-world pressures. He assigned her to the most demanding position on the ship, the close-in weapons system operator. The CWS, pronounced Sea Whiz by the crew, was the ship's last line of defense against incoming aircraft and missiles. It was an automated system capable of firing thousands of rounds per minute, but it required a human operator to make crucial decisions about when to engage targets. The margin for error was essentially zero. If she hesitated too long, the ship could be hit. If she fired too quickly, she might shoot down friendly aircraft. Training for the deployment was intense. Sarah spent hours each day learning the ship's systems, studying enemy aircraft capabilities, and practicing engagement protocols. The Mediterranean was a crowded airspace with military and civilian aircraft from dozens of countries. Identifying threats quickly and accurately was a skill that could only be developed through constant practice. The other crew members watched her with interest. Many had never served with a woman in a combat role before. Some were openly supportive, others were skeptical, and a few were quietly hostile. Sarah focused on her work and let her performance speak for itself. 2 weeks before deployment, during a final training exercise off the California coast, everything changed. The exercise was supposed to test the ship's defensive capabilities against simulated air attacks. But sometimes training becomes reality when you least expect it. The morning was perfect for naval operations. Clear skies, calm seas, and excellent visibility. Sarah was at her station, running through pre-exercise checks, when the radar operator reported multiple aircraft approaching from the south. The exercise wasn't scheduled to begin for another hour, but aircraft often arrived early for positioning. Sarah monitored her screen as the contacts appeared. Something felt wrong. The aircraft were approaching in a formation pattern she didn't recognize from the exercise plan, and their speed was higher than expected. She reported her observations to Lieutenant Commander Kim, who was reviewing the exercise schedule. As the aircraft came closer, Sarah's training kicked in. She began the target identification process, using the ship's sensors to determine what type of aircraft they were dealing with. The results made her blood run cold. These weren't Navy training aircraft. According to her identification system, they were foreign military jets, and they were armed. Kim rushed to her station and confirmed her readings. Within seconds, the ship's general alarm was sounding, and Captain Walsh was on the bridge. What was supposed to be a training exercise had suddenly become a potential combat situation. The aircraft continued their approach, ignoring radio warnings to identify themselves and change course. Intelligence later revealed they were from a terrorist group that had stolen military aircraft and were attempting to attack Navy ships during training exercises when they were most vulnerable. Sarah's hands were steady on her controls as the distance closed. Captain Walsh had given the order to prepare for engagement, but the final decision to fire would be hers. In combat, there wasn't time for committee decisions. The CIWS operator had to make split-second choices that could determine whether the ship survived or was destroyed. Through her earpiece, she could hear the bridge crew coordinating with other ships in the area and trying to contact the approaching aircraft. But Sarah's focus was entirely on her screen and the controls under her hands. Everything she had learned, all the training and preparation, had led to this moment. The first aircraft was now less than a mile away and closing fast. Sarah's finger hovered over the firing button as she made final calculations. Behind her, she could sense the entire crew holding their breath. In a few seconds, she would either save the ship or make the biggest mistake of her naval career. The tension on the bridge of the USS Porter was thick enough to cut with a knife. Sarah's heart pounded as she tracked the approaching aircraft through her targeting system. Every instinct told her these weren't friendly planes, but the consequences of being wrong were unthinkable. Shooting down aircraft in international waters could trigger an international incident or worse. Captain Walsh's voice crackled through the communication system as she tried one final time to contact the approaching aircraft. The radio silence was deafening. Sarah could see the aircraft clearly now through her high-powered scope. They were definitely military jets, sleek and deadly, with weapon pods mounted under their wings. Lieutenant Commander Kim stood directly behind Sarah, his hand resting on her shoulder. She could feel the slight tremor in his fingers, a sign of the pressure they were all under. In 15 years of naval service, he had never faced a situation quite like this during what was supposed to be a routine training exercise. The first aircraft was now 3/4 of a mile away and maintaining its attack vector directly toward the porter. Sarah's targeting computer had achieved a solid lock, and the familiar tone in her headset confirmed that her weapon system was ready to fire. Everything depended on her judgment in the next few seconds. Through her peripheral vision, Sarah noticed that the gun deck had suddenly become very quiet. The usual chatter and movement had stopped as crew members realized what was happening. Many of them had gathered at safe distances to watch, understanding they were witnessing something that would become part of naval history one way or another. Chief Petty Officer Hayes, who had initially doubted Sarah's ability to handle combat pressure, was operating a secondary weapons system nearby. He caught her eye for just a moment and gave her a small nod. That simple gesture carried more weight than any words could have. If Hayes believed in her ability to make this decision, she must be ready. The aircraft was now half a mile away, close enough that Sarah could make out specific details of its construction. Her identification systems confirmed what she had suspected. This was a stolen military aircraft that had no business being in this airspace during a Navy exercise. The pilot's intentions were becoming clearer with each passing second. Captain Walsh's voice came through the communications system one more time, this time directed at Sarah rather than the approaching aircraft. The order was simple, but carried enormous weight. Lieutenant Martinez, you are authorized to engage at your discretion. The safety of this ship and crew is in your hands. Sarah felt a strange calm settle over her as she heard those words. All the pressure and uncertainty faded away, replaced by the focused clarity that had carried her through years of training. Her breathing steadied, her hands stopped shaking, and her mind became absolutely clear about what needed to happen next. The first aircraft crossed into her engagement zone, the point at which she had to make her decision. Sarah's finger moved to the firing button as her other hand fine-tuned the targeting solution. The CIWS system was designed for exactly this moment: close-range defense against aircraft that had penetrated all other defensive layers. What happened next would be talked about in naval circles for decades. As the first aircraft reached the optimal engagement point, Sarah fired. The CWS system erupted with a sound like thunder, sending a stream of depleted uranium projectiles toward the target at incredible speed. Her aim was perfect. The aircraft disintegrated in a ball of fire and debris less than 300 yards from the ship. But there was no time to celebrate or even think about what she had just done. Her radar screen showed that the second aircraft was already adjusting its course and beginning its own attack run. Sarah's training took over completely as she swiveled her weapon system to track the new threat. The second pilot had clearly learned from watching his partner's destruction. Instead of maintaining a straight approach, he was flying an erratic pattern designed to make him harder to track and target. Sarah's targeting computer struggled to maintain a lock as the aircraft jinked left and right, up and down, using every evasive maneuver in the pilot's repertoire. This was exactly the kind of situation that separated good weapons operators from great ones. The computer systems could handle straightforward attacks, but complex evasive actions required human intuition and split-second decision-making. Sarah had to predict where the aircraft would be when her rounds arrived, not where it was when she pulled the trigger. She watched the aircraft's pattern for 3 seconds, just long enough to identify the pilot's preferred evasive sequence. Most pilots, even experienced ones, fell into predictable patterns when under stress. This one favored left turns and tended to climb after each maneuver. Sarah adjusted her aim accordingly and waited for the perfect moment. When it came, she fired again. This time, The engagement took place at a longer range as the aircraft was still maneuvering aggressively. Sarah's rounds caught the aircraft just as it entered a climbing turn, exactly where she had predicted it would be. The second aircraft exploded in an even more spectacular fireball than the first, its fuel and ammunition detonating simultaneously. The entire engagement had lasted exactly 6 seconds from first shot to final explosion. In that brief time, Sarah had successfully defended her ship against 2 attacking aircraft, prevented potential casualties among her crew, and proved that women could perform in combat roles just as effectively as their male counterparts. The silence that followed was profound. For a moment, the only sounds on the gun deck were the distant rumble of aircraft engines from the legitimate training exercise and the gentle wash of waves against the ship's hull. Then, slowly, the reality of what had just happened began to sink in among the crew. Lieutenant Commander Kim was the first to speak, his voice carrying a mixture of relief and amazement. "Outstanding shooting, Lieutenant. Absolutely outstanding." His words broke the spell, and suddenly, the gun deck erupted in cheers and congratulations from crew members who had witnessed the engagement. But Sarah wasn't ready to celebrate yet. Her training had taught her that successful engagements were often followed by additional threats, and she kept her eyes on the radar screen for several more minutes before finally allowing herself to relax. Only when Captain Walsh personally confirmed that the airspace was clear did Sarah step back from her weapon station. The aftermath of the engagement was a whirlwind of activity. Navy investigators arrived within hours to interview everyone involved and examine the debris from the destroyed aircraft. The incident was classified at the highest levels as intelligence officials tried to determine how terrorist groups had acquired military aircraft and planned their attack. Sarah found herself at the center of an investigation that would eventually span multiple government agencies. Her actions during the engagement were scrutinized in detail, with every decision and split-second judgment analyzed by experts who had never faced similar pressure. The conclusion was unanimous. Her performance had been flawless. Word of the engagement spread quickly through Navy channels, despite official attempts to keep the details classified. Within days, Sarah's name was being mentioned in conversations at the Pentagon and in naval bases around the world. The story grew in the telling, with some versions claiming she had shot down 5 aircraft instead of 2, but the core facts remained consistent. The Navy's official response was carefully measured. While they praised Sarah's performance and recommended her for commendation, they were also careful not to turn the incident into a political statement about women in combat roles. The service was still adapting to the relatively recent changes that allowed women to serve in combat positions, and they wanted to focus on individual merit rather than gender politics. For Sarah, the days following the engagement were both exhilarating and exhausting. She was proud of her performance and grateful that no one on her ship had been injured, but she was also processing the reality that she had killed 2 people. Even in clear self-defense situations, taking human life carried psychological weight that training could only partially prepare someone for. Captain Walsh, who had faced similar challenges during her own career, made sure Sarah had access to counseling resources and took time to talk with her privately about the emotional aspects of combat. The captain's guidance proved invaluable as Sarah worked through the complex feelings that followed her first combat engagement. The crew's attitude towards Sarah changed dramatically after the incident. The skeptics who had questioned whether women belonged in combat roles became some of her strongest supporters. The respect she had been working to earn for months was now freely given, based not on her gender or her academy performance, but on her proven ability to perform under the ultimate pressure. Chief Hayes, who had been her harshest critic during training, became an unexpected ally. He publicly acknowledged that he had been wrong about women in combat and used Sarah's performance as an example when training new crew members. His change of heart carried significant weight among the enlisted personnel and helped create a more accepting environment for other women serving in similar roles. The official commendation ceremony took place 3 weeks later, with representatives from the Pentagon in attendance. Sarah received the Navy Commendation Medal for her actions, along with a personal commendation from the Chief of Naval Operations. The ceremony was attended by her parents, who had flown from Texas to witness their daughter's recognition. Miguel Martinez, who had always been proud of his daughter, was overwhelmed by the magnitude of her achievement. Watching her receive recognition from some of the Navy's highest-ranking officers was a moment he would treasure for the rest of his life. Sarah's mother was equally proud, but also worried about the attention her daughter was receiving and what it might mean for her future safety. The ceremony marked the beginning of a new phase in Sarah's naval career. She was no longer just another junior officer trying to prove herself. She was now seen as a pioneer who had demonstrated women's capability in combat roles. With that recognition came new opportunities, but also new pressures and expectations. Several senior officers approached Sarah after the ceremony with offers of advanced training and specialized assignments. The Navy was eager to develop officers who had proven themselves in combat, and Sarah's technical skills made her particularly valuable for positions involving advanced weapon systems. But the incident had also attracted attention from outside the military. Defense contractors wanted to consult with her about weapon system design, military academies wanted her to speak to their cadets, and women's organizations wanted to use her story to promote gender equality in the armed forces. Sarah found herself navigating requests and opportunities she had never imagined would come her way. The media attention was particularly challenging. While the Navy had managed to keep most details of the incident classified, enough information had leaked to make Sarah a subject of public interest. Reporters called her parents' home in Texas, trying to get interviews about her background and her thoughts on women in combat. Sarah declined most media requests, preferring to let her service record speak for itself. She understood that her story had broader implications for military policy and women's rights, but she also wanted to maintain her focus on being the best naval officer she could be. Politics and publicity were distractions from her primary mission of defending her country. The deployment to the Mediterranean continued as planned, though with heightened security measures following the terrorist attack. Sarah's responsibilities expanded as Lieutenant Commander Kim gave her more autonomy in training other crew members and developing defensive protocols. Her combat experience gave her insights that couldn't be learned from textbooks or simulations. During quiet moments on the deployment, Sarah often found herself thinking about those 6 seconds that had changed everything. She had always known that military service involved the possibility of combat, but the reality of life and death decision-making had been more intense than anything she could have imagined. The experience had taught her that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the ability to function effectively despite being afraid. In those crucial seconds, she had been terrified of making the wrong decision, but her training had allowed her to overcome that fear and do what needed to be done. As the deployment continued, Sarah began to understand that her role in the Navy had fundamentally changed. She was no longer fighting just to prove that women could serve in combat roles. She was now helping to define what that service would look like. Her performance had opened doors, but it had also created expectations that she would continue to excel in increasingly challenging situations. 3 months after the incident that made her name legendary throughout the Navy, Lieutenant Sarah Martinez stood on the bridge of the USS Porter watching the sun rise over the Mediterranean. The deployment was nearing its end, but the changes in her life were just beginning. What had started as a routine training exercise had transformed not only her career, but also the Navy's understanding of women's capabilities in combat roles. The immediate aftermath of her successful engagement had been intense, but Sarah had learned to navigate the attention while maintaining her focus on her duties. She had become something she never expected to be, a symbol. Young women considering military careers wrote her letters asking for advice. Fellow officers sought her input on weapons systems and defensive strategies. Military historians wanted to document her experience for future study. But Sarah's greatest impact was being felt in the day-to-day operations of the Navy itself. Captain Walsh had submitted a detailed report about Sarah's performance that was circulated among senior leadership. The report didn't just describe what had happened during those crucial 6 seconds. It analyzed how Sarah's training, decision-making process, and technical skills had contributed to the successful defense of the ship. The report had reached Admiral Catherine Rodriguez, the first woman to serve as Chief of Naval Operations. Admiral Rodriguez had faced many of the same challenges Sarah was experiencing, having broken barriers throughout her own career. She saw in Sarah's story an opportunity to accelerate changes that were long overdue in naval combat roles. Within weeks of receiving Captain Walsh's report, Admiral Rodriguez had initiated a comprehensive review of policies regarding women in combat positions. The review wasn't just about opening more positions to women. It was about ensuring that the most qualified personnel were assigned to critical roles regardless of gender. Sarah's performance had provided concrete evidence that gender was irrelevant when it came to combat effectiveness. The policy changes that followed were significant, but implemented quietly to avoid political controversy. Women were given access to specialized weapons training that had previously been restricted to men. Combat duty assignments were restructured to focus on capability rather than gender. Most importantly, the informal barriers that had kept women out of certain positions began to crumble as commanders saw the tangible benefits of merit-based assignments. Sarah found herself at the center of these changes whether she wanted to be or not. She was selected for advanced weapons systems training that would prepare her for assignment to the Navy's most sophisticated ships. The training was intense and highly classified, involving weapons systems so advanced that only a handful of officers had access to them. During her weapons training, Sarah worked alongside some of the Navy's most experienced combat veterans. These were officers who had served in multiple deployments and faced every kind of threat imaginable. Their acceptance of her as an equal was perhaps more meaningful than any official recognition she had received. Master Chief Petty Officer James Morrison, who had 30 years of experience with naval weapons systems, became one of Sarah's most important mentors. Morrison had initially been skeptical about training women for advanced combat roles, but Sarah's performance during the terrorist attack had changed his perspective completely. Morrison taught Sarah advanced techniques that weren't covered in standard training programs. He showed her how to maintain weapons systems under combat conditions, how to troubleshoot problems when computer systems failed, and how to make critical decisions when operating with incomplete information. Most importantly, he taught her how to train others and pass on knowledge to the next generation of naval officers. The relationship between Morrison and Sarah became a model for how senior enlisted personnel could work with junior officers to improve overall combat effectiveness. Their collaboration was so successful that the Navy began using their training methods as a template for other advanced weapons programs. As Sarah's reputation grew, she began receiving requests for specialized assignments that would have been unthinkable for someone in her rank just a year earlier. Defense contractors wanted her input on new weapons systems. Naval intelligence wanted her to evaluate foreign military capabilities. The Pentagon wanted her to participate in strategic planning sessions for future conflicts. One of the most significant opportunities came from the Naval War College, which invited Sarah to participate in a classified study of modern naval combat. The study was examining how technological advances and changing threat patterns were affecting naval strategy. Sarah's real-world combat experience made her perspective particularly valuable. During her time at the War College, Sarah worked with senior officers from around the world who were grappling with similar challenges in their own navies. She discovered that the questions facing the U.S. Navy about women in combat roles were part of a broader international discussion about military effectiveness and gender equality. Her contributions to the study were so insightful that she was invited to present her findings to a joint session of NATO naval commanders. Standing before admirals and senior officers from a dozen countries, Sarah presented a detailed analysis of how modern naval combat required the best possible personnel in critical positions regardless of traditional gender roles. The presentation was a watershed moment not just for Sarah, but for women serving in navies around the world. Her combination of theoretical knowledge and practical combat experience gave her credibility that couldn't be disputed. The NATO commanders left the session with a new understanding of how gender integration could improve rather than compromise military effectiveness. Word of Sarah's presentation reached the highest levels of the Pentagon, where officials were already planning the next phase of military modernization. Sarah was selected for promotion to lieutenant commander and assigned to a special projects office that was developing the Navy's next generation of combat systems. The assignment was both an honor and a challenge. Sarah would be working on classified projects that could determine how naval combat would be conducted for decades to come. Her combat experience would inform the design of weapons systems that might be used by naval officers who weren't even born yet. In her new role, Sarah worked with defense contractors, research scientists, and military strategists to develop integrated combat systems that could respond to multiple threats simultaneously. The technology was incredibly advanced, involving artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and weapons systems that could operate autonomously under certain conditions. But Sarah's most important contribution wasn't technical. It was human. She insisted that the new systems be designed with operators of all physical capabilities in mind. Traditional weapons systems had been designed assuming that operators would be tall, strong men. Sarah's influence helped create systems that could be operated effectively by anyone with the necessary training and skills. The impact of this seemingly small change was enormous. When the new weapons systems were deployed, they could be operated by a much larger pool of potential crew members. This increased flexibility allowed ships to maintain combat effectiveness even when dealing with personnel shortages or casualties. Sarah's work on the Special Projects team also brought her into contact with some of the most innovative minds in military technology. She collaborated with engineers who were developing hypersonic weapons, scientists who were working on directed energy systems, and strategists who were planning for conflicts that might not occur for decades. These collaborations broadened Sarah's understanding of military technology far beyond naval weapon systems. She began to see how different military branches could work together more effectively and how technological advances in one area could benefit others. Her insights contributed to the development of joint service training programs that improve coordination between the Army, Navy, and Air Force. As her expertise grew, Sarah found herself serving as an unofficial ambassador for women in military technology roles. Young women considering STEM careers often sought her advice, and she made time to mentor them despite her demanding schedule. She understood that her success had opened doors that needed to remain open for future generations. The mentoring work was particularly rewarding because Sarah could see the direct impact of her efforts. Women who had been inspired by her story were entering military academies, pursuing advanced degrees in engineering, and accepting challenging assignments that previous generations of women had been denied. One of Sarah's proudest moments came when Jessica Chun, her former Naval Academy roommate, was selected for fighter pilot training. Jessica's acceptance into the program was based entirely on her qualifications, but she credited Sarah's example with giving her the confidence to pursue such an ambitious goal. The friendship that had sustained them through the challenges of the academy continued to provide mutual support as their careers advanced. The 5-year anniversary of Sarah's combat engagement was marked by a ceremony at the Naval War College that recognized the broader changes her actions had catalyzed. Representatives from women's organizations, military leaders, and government officials gathered to discuss the progress that had been made in military gender integration. Sarah was invited to speak at the ceremony, but she chose to focus her remarks on the future rather than the past. She talked about the young women and men who were entering military service with capabilities and perspectives that would make the armed forces stronger. She emphasized that the goal was never to prove that women could do everything men could do, but to ensure that the military had access to the best possible talent regardless of gender. The audience included many of the people who had been part of Sarah's journey. Captain Walsh, who had been promoted to admiral, Chief Hayes, who had become one of the Navy's most effective advocates for inclusive training programs, and Lieutenant Commander Kim, who now commanded his own ship and had requested several women officers for his crew. But perhaps the most meaningful presence at the ceremony was Sarah's parents, Miguel and Carmen Martinez, who had traveled from Texas to witness their daughter's recognition. Miguel, now in his 60s, still marveled at how his little girl who had loved taking apart radios had become one of the Navy's most respected weapons experts. As Sarah looked out at the audience during her speech, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. What had started with a teenager's curiosity about how things worked had evolved into a career that had changed military policy and opened opportunities for thousands of other women. But Sarah knew that her story was just one chapter in a much larger transformation of the military. The young women graduating from the Naval Academy now had opportunities that seemed impossible just a decade earlier. They could serve on combat ships, operate advanced weapons systems, and command vessels in ways that previous generations of women could only dream about. The technological advances Sarah had helped develop were also changing the nature of military service itself. Modern weapons systems required operators who could think quickly, process complex information, and make critical decisions under pressure. Physical strength, while still important, was less critical than mental agility and technical expertise. As the ceremony concluded, Sarah was approached by a young ensign named Maria Santos, who had just graduated from a Naval Academy with the highest scores ever recorded in weapons systems training. Santos told Sarah that she had been inspired to join the Navy after reading about the incident 5 years earlier, and that she hoped to follow a similar career path. Looking at Ensign Santos, Sarah saw the future of the Navy, talented, confident, and ready to serve without having to prove that women belonged in combat roles. The barriers that Sarah had helped break down would never be rebuilt, and each new generation of women officers would face fewer obstacles than the previous one. That evening, as Sarah stood alone on the deck of a ship moored at the War College, she thought about the 6 seconds that had changed everything. In that brief moment of combat, she had defended her ship and crew, but the ripple effects had extended far beyond anything she could have imagined. The Navy was stronger because it could draw on the full range of human talent. Young women could pursue military careers without artificial limitations. Combat effectiveness had improved because merit rather than gender-determined assignments. And Sarah Martinez, the mechanic's daughter from Texas who had always been curious about how things worked, had played a small but significant role in making it all possible. The stars reflected on the calm water as Sarah considered her next assignment. There would always be new challenges, new technologies to master, and new barriers to overcome. But she faced the future with the same confidence that had carried her through that crucial engagement 5 years earlier. She had learned that true strength wasn't about proving others wrong. It was about doing the job so well that gender became irrelevant. And as she prepared for whatever challenges lay ahead, Sarah knew that the most important battles had already been won, not just by her, but by all the women who had served before her, and all those who would serve in the future. The Navy that had once questioned whether women belonged on gun decks now knew that the best person for any job was simply the most qualified person, regardless of gender. And Lieutenant Commander Sarah Martinez, who had dropped 2 jets in 6 seconds, had helped make that transformation possible.